If you just do it, it'll turn out okay. And welcome to the podcast that eventually has everybody on, hopefully. Fucking out with caffeine. I have a guest today. I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Jason. I'm the host of the Dragons and Genesis podcast. It's a monthly secular Bible study show that digs deep into things like comparative literature and mythology and how that relates to the different Bible stories.
So, what got you interested in that?
Well, I started off really as a Christian, and at some point in my early 20s, I guess, I had some questions, and I wasn't getting satisfactory answers from like the church leaders. So I started reading the Bible, and the more I read and the more I learned about it, the more questions I seemed to have, and the more confusion there was. So I started buying books that would help me understand this rich and complex book. And the more books I read about it and the more I learned, the less sense the whole thing made. And I quickly came to the realization that this was not like an accurate history of anything. This was not something that really uh, shed any light on reality, but was instead a complicated and often contradictory collection of myths from the Iron Age. And understood that, a lot of pieces started to fall into place. But then I really needed to learn more. I needed to understand where all of these stories came from and how they came to be collected, and how it came to be like the number one selling book in history, and why so many people place this book at the sort of center of their lives, even though they've never read it and certainly don't understand it. And, and somewhere along the way, I started sharing the information I'd gathered in the form of a podcast.
Awesome. So, How long have you been doing this now?
I think the show has been going on for about 11 years, I think.
Wow, about as long as this show's been going on.
Yeah, I started, like I said, I think it was about 11 years ago. I came up with the idea of doing a podcast, and within a couple of days, I purchased a microphone. I wrote the first 2 episodes, and I recorded the thing all within just a couple days. Um, and the quality of those early episodes definitely, you know,
Mhm.
is evidence of how little I knew about doing a show, and how little effort was actually put into those episodes. It was actually recorded in the front seat of a truck. I was a truck driver at the time whenever I started.
Wow, nice.
Um, yeah, I drove my truck over to a Best Buy near Kankakee, Illinois. I picked up a microphone, and that evening I recorded the first episode from the driver's seat parked in a truck stop. Um, and over the course of the next year, I covered the entire book of Genesis, and that was gonna be it. It was I was just going to, do a sort of deep dive into uh, the the mythology behind the book of Genesis, and that was it. I wasn't gonna do anything after that. It was just gonna be about a 12 or 14 miniseries, and then I was gonna shut down the show. Um,
Things changed.
yeah, by the time I was about halfway through, I was getting messages from people, because somehow people started listening to the show, but I started getting messages from people asking when I was gonna wrap up Genesis and start in on the Moses story. So by the time I finished Genesis, I figured I had to go ahead and do the book of Exodus. And pretty soon I realized I was kind of stuck doing the Torah. And by the time the first 5 books of the Bible were done, I had so many people asking about different stories that I realized I was probably going to have to do the whole Old Testament. Now I'm halfway through the book of Mark. I've already covered 7 of the letters of Paul. I've covered the book of Enoch. And I realized that the entire Bible, along with a bunch of apocryphal books, probably not in the copy you have, are also going to be done. And once I'm finally finished with that, um, I have a list of about 50 or 60 other pieces of Christian and Jewish scripture will need to also be covered. Um, so yeah, it's become what was supposed to be like a few months as like a little, hobby, has turned into more than a decade of work and still has many more years of work in the future. Uh, so I'll
Nice.
probably be doing this for the rest of my life.
Uh, cool. So about 2 months ago, I had Dr. Kip on the channel,
Oh, okay, yeah.
and he said, at least in biblical scholars, there's at least two confirmed sources. There might be more, but there's at least two confirmed. It's the priestly source and the not priestly source.
Right.
There might be more, but that those aren't really confirmed yet. So
Right.
do both of those, like in the like the book of like the first book of Genesis, or first 2 books of Genesis, there's two different creation stories. Do they both come from different they both the sources come from different places?
Yes. So, and for anyone who's not quite familiar with this is a revised version of the documentary hypothesis. It's where I believe in the 1800s, biblical scholars noticed like there were duplicate versions of stories, like where a patriarch travels to a foreign land and sells his wife into the harem of the king to avoid getting in trouble with the locals. And this happens like 3 times in the book of Genesis. And so they noticed that there were these little doublets like that and started to realize that the not only the book of Genesis, but the entirety of the Torah was a collection of multiple stories from multiple different sources, and they labeled them J, E, D, and P. J for Yahweh, and this was the German spelling. Um, E for the Elohist, which is another name for God, El or Elohim. Uh, D for the Deuteronomist, who wrote the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy and a few other bits and pieces here and there, and P, the priestly source. And then there was some pushback, things kind of went back and forth. And what scholars look at now is they identify the priestly material, and then they kind of argue about how to subdivide the rest of the material. The non-priestly material, is it really J, E, and D? Or is J and E really the same thing? And then you have D? Or is it all just a mix of random things? Everyone kinda has their own little pet theory, but you can pretty easily, distinguish the priestly versus the non-priestly material. And so when you look at something like the opening chapters of Genesis, in the first chapter, the God is named El, and he kinda just speaks everything into existence. But then when you and it there's like a specific order, of, when things happen and all that. And it kinda culminates with the creation of humanity. Men and women are created together. They're not given names. And it's not like one man and one woman. It's just, men and women all at once, and they're created in the image of the gods. And then it kind of reaches its little climax with the creation of the Sabbath. And then right after that, in chapter 2, you have a brand new creation story. This time it's called Yahweh, and he's like, actually like getting his hands dirty, like picking up clay and molding it, like sculpting a person. And then he's like, and he breathes, like actually breathes life into him. So instead of just making people, a whole race of them, and here he molds a person out of clay, and he has to breathe on him to get him to start working. And then he sets him to work as a slave in his little magic garden to grow food for him and all the other gods. Um, and then he uses a part of that little person to make a woman. And then later they end up getting names, but all the names come from the guy, like the little clay man. He comes up with all the names. And everything that's created is in a completely different order. And the state of the world is completely different. In chapter 1, it's this big dark ocean. The whole world is a giant dark ocean. Um, but then in chapter 2, there's no water. Water doesn't exist. It's this whole big dry desert. And he's like, "Oh, look, I'm gonna have these 4 rivers that come out of this one spring, and they're gonna flow off in different directions, and that's gonna provide all the water for the entire world. And I'm gonna make a garden over here, and then I'm gonna make my little clay man to tend the garden for me." So these are these two are very different creation stories. They share almost nothing in common. It's different gods, different amounts of people are created. Everything's created in a different way, in different orders. Um, they're entirely different. You cannot reconcile the two. And so, yeah, they are very different sources. And it looks like chapter 2 is actually older than chapter 1. Chapter 1, was likely added at a later date, or was a much later story, and they took these 2 and stitched them into the book, at some point. But
Yeah,
um,
so I wonder what gave chapter 1 the head start. The head start, if it was a later book, was that, you know what, you're later, but we're gonna make you for number 1.
yeah, so part of it may have been that the scope was so grand. Sort of like how you start off the New Testament by using Matthew's gospel, even though Matthew is actually a rewrite of Mark. Mark was our first gospel. Um, but Matthew it's bigger, it's more detailed, and it starts off with a birth narrative. And so you put that first, and it now becomes the most important one. It gives you a good place to start. And so
Even though
yeah,
it got the genealogy all wrong from the Old
yeah.
Testament.
And Matthew and Luke, they both did that, and they seem to have both been trying to. Um, that's actually kind of a funny story. So, Mark's gospel, he has this whole thing. Jesus basically arrives on the scene as an adult. He starts his ministry, and he's running around doing all of these different things. He's working miracles and preaching in parables and things like that. Um, the problem that some people encountered was that they were trying to link Jesus with David, which of course means having Jesus linked with the city of Nazareth, the city of Bethlehem. But Mark kept calling Jesus a Nazarite, and or a Nazorian. I'm sorry. So he keeps calling Jesus a Nazorian, and the author of Matthew, or actually both Matthew and Luke, they saw this, and when they were writing their gospels, they misunderstood what Mark was saying. They thought that he meant that he was from the city of Nazareth, which might not have even been inhabited at the time that Jesus lived. That city may not have even existed yet. But even if it did, Mark never said that Jesus was from Nazareth. He called him a Nazorian, as in like the sect of Nazor. It was this little known Jewish sect. Matthew and Luke both misunderstood that and thought that he was from the city of Nazareth. The problem is he's also supposed to be linked with David, and so they're trying to link him with Bethlehem. And
Yeah,
so they
yeah,
create these nativity stories,
yeah.
and they're these weird contrived, tales
I yeah,
that have been traveling all over to
yeah, I think
make.
it.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think if I remember from I think in Matthew they were already living there, and then in Luke they like let's make a tax reason for coming.
Right, right. So in Matthew, they live in Bethlehem, and then in like I think 4 BCE or earlier, we don't know exactly when, just during the life of Herod, um, he decides to try to kill all the little baby Jewish boys that are about 2 years old, meaning Jesus had to have been born about 2 years before that. Okay, so about 6 BCE or earlier, and so then they flee. Like they're born in Joseph's house in Bethlehem where they live, and then they flee. They go down to Egypt for a while, and then they come back. They're on their way to return home, and then an angel pops up and goes, "Oh, hang on. I'm sorry. I know I just told you that it was safe to go back, but Herod's relative is ruling over Bethlehem, so it's not going to be safe for you." Which doesn't make any sense because they would have thought that they had gotten Jesus along with all the other little Jewish babies. They thought it was successful. So that wouldn't even make any sense. But let's assume it does somehow. So then they go up to Nazareth and they settle there. What the author of Matthew didn't realize was that Nazareth was ruled by another of Herod's relatives, so they wouldn't have been safe there either. But they do that. But in Luke's version, they live in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. It takes place about a dozen years later during the census of Quirinius, and they, for some reason, have to travel to Bethlehem, where they do not live, even though during a census you kind of need to stay put where you do live because they need to count all your stuff, not have you travel to an arbitrarily chosen ancestor from 1,000 years before. Um, and so they travel down there in order to be counted, and then they end up going into like a cave or a manger, or depending on which version of the story you read, some other place. Um, and then that's how that little story goes, right? But both of these are contrived in order to link Jesus with both the city of Nazareth and the city of Bethlehem. So he can be born in Bethlehem, but he can be called a Nazorian because they think that meant Nazareth. It actually meant he was of the sect of Nazor. So they're
So well,
inventing
do you know what
completely
that's?
different stories to solve a problem that didn't actually exist.
Yeah, I've heard of several sects of the.
That Jesus
I remember. Yeah, I remember that. What was that sect about?
Oh, hang on. Oh, sorry. Something. I suddenly can't hear you. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I could hear you.
Um,
I can hear you again.
okay, is that better?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened. So anyway, so Mark actually says, I believe in chapter 5, that Jesus is from Capernaum. So he's not even from. Mark didn't even say that he was from Nazareth. The only time he's mentioned as being from Nazareth is in a later interpolation that was kind of pinned in because at some point, people are like, okay, well, Matthew and Luke both say he's from Nazareth. We need Mark to say the same. Um, Matthew copied from Mark and added his own material. Luke copied from both. And then John just kind of went in his own direction, after reading those earlier gospels and just kind of wrote his from scratch.
Yeah, yeah. I had a little theory going learning about the stuff. It was the first one, and it was and Mark, he was just a human that got adopted by God. In Matthew and Luke, he's a demigod, half God, half human, and then in John, he's fully divine the whole time.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. He comes down and like he's just like this miracle worker who can't even work miracles all the time in the Gospel of Mark. Like he goes home to Capernaum and he tries to work some miracles and he can't, and like his family makes fun of him for it. And then in later thing, by the time you get to John, he's basically God incarnate. So yeah, it's these gospels do not tell the same story.
Yeah, I think John was the only one where he didn't need help with the cross. He did it all by himself.
Yeah. He just like, yeah, he just, you know, um, yeah, they are four entirely different stories.
The
And they're not
multiverse.
even our only four. There are about 40 gospels that we know of. We have some of the others, but like Mark, even though Mark was the original, Mark almost didn't make the cut. The Gospel of Peter was far more common, and it almost became the fourth gospel. So we would have had like Matthew, Luke, Peter, and John, and Peter was wild. Like at the end of it, like at the resurrection, instead of like an angel popping out and the women are like, oh no, and they run away and never say anything, a giant cross like comes up out of the tomb and it's like 50 feet tall and it starts talking to them. Like it's got some pretty wild stuff. So we almost got that. Unfortunately, we got stuck, with the four that we have. But there's some really cool gospels out there, including some of the infancy gospels. Oh, Breeze in the chat. Yeah, like one of the infancy gospels, it talks about like Jesus's young life, and like his teachers are afraid of him because he keeps killing people with his magical powers. It's like children. He's over there just like murdering people. I forget how many people he kills. I think it was like maybe the infancy gospel of James.
Wow.
I'm trying to remember. I haven't read those in quite a while. I will be covering them eventually. But yeah, they're crazy stories. Anne Rice actually wrote a book about the young life of Jesus, and it was based on one of those infancy gospels. So yeah, it's all like some really weird stuff. And in Egypt, this place called Nag Hammadi, they actually found what was really cool was they found a new Christian gospel that was being written, and it was rolled up and it was tucked away in a vase and buried. And with it was another text that they were copying from, and it was this pagan myth, and Christians were literally copying it over, like taking it like paragraph by paragraph and turning it into a story about Jesus. And so we can see that, early Christianity, they were blatantly ripping off popular stories from the surrounding culture in order to create the life of Jesus. Their stories, their biography, the teachings, it wasn't original to them. It was being either fabricated or borrowed from other sources.
Yeah, I didn't know this until a few years ago, but it's like there were like so many different sects of Christianity even before the Council of Nicaea, where they made this stuff official.
Yeah. Yeah, Christianity, as far as we can tell, was always fragmented. Um, and what's strange is if you go back to like the first century BCE and you look at some of the communities, some of the apocalyptic Jews that lived in the region, if you looked at them and then you looked at the beliefs of early Christians, you can't really tell much of a difference. So if Jesus showed up in the first century and interacted with like the Essenes or the Ebionites, he would have looked at these people and said, "Holy crap, I'm surrounded by Christians," because like these people, like Christianity seemed to have been a thing that was slowly evolving for, um, you know, maybe like the mid second century BC. When a lot of this apocalyptic literature, like the first book of Enoch and the book of Daniel, were written, and you it's no coincidence or among the most frequently referenced in the New Testament. They are constantly drawing upon those sources whenever they're writing these New Testament stories, and for good reason. That's where the idea came from. It's second century BCE, and it's just been fermenting for a couple of centuries by the time the New Testament is written. And of course, with this, since it's not really coming from one group, it's coming from, you know, a multitude of people and has been growing for a couple of centuries. By the time they're writing these New Testament texts, you have all of these different communities. And that's what the Gospels were. Matthew was not meant to be read alongside Mark. Matthew was meant to replace the Gospel of Mark, just as Luke was meant to replace Mark and Matthew, and John was meant to replace all of them. Each of these Gospels was written as the one gospel for one community. And everyone was doing that. Everyone was writing their own gospel for their own community.
So do you know why
So,
these four made the cut and the other ones didn't?
oh, one was popularity. These were incredibly popular. And the reason for the number four was four is almost, it's not exactly a magic number, but it sort of it kind of represents completion. And you kind of think of that in modern terms when someone says, they travel to the four corners of the earth. It doesn't mean that the earth is a square and it has these four corners and they went to each of them. It means that you went everywhere looking for this thing or whatever. And so it was kind of a phrase, and you actually see it a lot in apocalyptic literature. Uh, when the number four pops up, it tends to mean something, the whole of something, So they kind of wanted there to be four, and some early bishops talked about, having four gospels and then a bunch of other letters and stuff like that. And they would talk about like which books they had sort of selected for their group, for their congregation, for the people in their little region of the Roman Empire. Um, and it kind of just grew organically. It was a long, complex process. And at no point did anyone just sit down and like put it to a vote. Like you actually see things like that, especially in like recent media. Oh, well, at this time, at this council or whatever, these people made this decision to have these books. And that didn't happen. It was just books that were more popular, uh, books that were sort of more inclusive, at least to a broader range of Christians, tended to kind of rise to the top, while the ones that were more obscure or propped up, like different sects of Christianity that were becoming sort
Like
of like less popular,
like
more
like the
whatever.
Assyrians or the I think one starts with an N or something. I forget what all different branches were.
Yeah.
That they're who like the people who thought God was as a human, and people thought God was both, or people thought that believed in Trinity, didn't believe in Trinity. It's all different.
Yeah. Um, so what is this thing doing?
So let's rewind a bit back to the originals. So what are the two origin stories? The two origin stories.
So the first one is the 6 Day creation story, which is based on the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian creation epic in which uh, the gods are being tormented by a bunch of dragons, and the god Marduk goes and he fights Tiamat, and he kills the main dragon, and the body of create the universe. Its carcass makes up the firmament, and then from there they're able to build the rest of the world. And this is where the 6 Day creation story of Genesis 1 comes from. And there's remnants of that in there, where the breath of God, which, the wind was one of the things that Marduk used to fight Tiamat, um, is moving over the face of the water, and it's called the Tehom, uh, which is, recalls the name Tiamat. It's the great primordial ocean. And then what he does is he comes along and he defeats it. He overcomes the chaos of the ocean, which chaos is what Tiamat represents. And once that is overcome, then all of creation can proceed from there. And then Genesis 2, that's your Garden of Eden creation story. And that's where you have this sort of like craftsman god, which is what Yahweh kind of represents in this, who comes along and he builds the first people out of clay in order to have them go and work in his little magic garden. Uh, and that story also existed elsewhere. Like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, this is all over Mesopotamia and North Africa. Stories very similar to that, including the idea that there would be a trickster god that would come along at some point and deceive some people, and their punishment would ultimately have them being cut off from further contact with their deity, just as you have with the snake, you know, going and doing its little thing in the Garden of Eden, and then they get kicked out. And so those two stories, while wildly different, uh, you can find both of them in Babylon, which they may have picked up both of them there. During they spent about 50 or so years, yeah, as captives in Babylon. The ruling class of Judah was hauled off when King Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE. And it was during this time that they encountered a lot of Babylonian culture, stories, and stuff like that, and they adopted a lot of these things. Um, they
If,
had
if I
sweeping changes to everything from like their alphabet to their mythology, all stemming from this one event.
Yeah, I heard that. I think I heard that in the early you can even see it in the scriptures. The early Bible was more polytheistic than monotheistic, and
Yeah, it's actually difficult to make a case for monotheism in the Bible. One of my episodes, I don't remember which one, I actually do a count, and I identified over 40 different deities that are claimed to exist in the Bible, most of which are in the Old Testament. But this continues on through the New Testament as well. There's a whole host of other gods that the New Testament mentions as if they are real, including some of the Greek gods, like they're just in there. Um, and so, yeah, the idea that the Jews were monotheistic, that like they started going in that direction. But when most of these stories were written, no, they worshipped, or they were promoting the worship of a single deity to the exclusion of others. but they were not denying these others existed. And the idea that you should worship only one of them was a fairly late concept to them. Uh, we've got we've got mentions of these other gods in material outside of the Bible as late as like the 5th century BC. So you're talking like 500 years before Christianity, they're openly worshiping other deities. Um, and it could have and likely continued on after that. We actually have mentioned from 2nd century BCE material that there were Jews who worshipped Inanna openly. And there were like some of these Jews who were upset about that, and they're like, "Oh, we don't think they should be doing this." Like there's like talismans and stuff that they wore as like little magical amulets, and these were things for other gods as late as like the mid 2nd century BC. So the idea that they were monotheist, yeah, they eventually became that, but that was a long process, and much of the Old Testament seems to have already existed, and they were still worshiping other gods.
So by the time of the New Testament, were they still polytheistic, or was that area only one and done?
No, so most of the Jews seem to have been uh, they were worshiping one god, but it still seems that they believed in multiple, or at least some of them did. And if you look at early Christianity, they very much seem to believe in multiple gods. Like they'll talk about Jesus, in some of these texts as like an earthly incarnation of Yahweh, but then they're referencing his Father in heaven, and the title they'll use for him is the God Most High, which is another way of saying El Elyon, who was the father of Yahweh. And they'll start talking about the female spirit of wisdom, which is the goddess Asherah. And so, like you're like just right there, you're talking about 3 different gods, and this was throughout early Christianity. Now, of course, each little group could have their own particular beliefs, but monotheism may actually be a post-biblical concept. It's possible that it wasn't until 2nd, 3rd, 4th century that they really switched over to monotheism for the Christians and possibly even the Jews, because the Jews still had text in like the 2nd and 3rd century CE that talks about other divine beings, aside from Yahweh. So it it really seems like going into the Middle Ages is when they're trying to clean up a lot of these things and simplify the heavens and say, okay, look, we know we've demoted a lot of these gods and turned them into angels. We need to do that with the rest of them. And
Like
so, yeah,
yeah, they made some angels, like probably some demon, but they turned some of the demons, I'm guessing.
yeah. And that's basically what they did to the whole pantheon, which is that wasn't even their idea. That was a concept they borrowed from Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism took a lot of these different gods and gradually turned them into spirits who served Ahura Mazda. And of course, the ones they didn't like became spirits that served Ahriman. And so you ended up with this whole good versus evil thing, and the gods were now concerned with personal morality and all of that.
And they didn't care. They didn't care before.
Right. Because if you look and you read like the Greek myths and stuff like that, the gods really didn't care what you did, as long as you didn't like mess with their priests or desecrate their temple.
Or if
they
you
didn't care what you did,
or if you're good enough to have sex with.
Right. So yeah, like if you were hot, and a god or goddess showed up and you said yes, okay, yeah, you're cool. Otherwise, if you went around like torching villages and stuff, they didn't care,
As long as you sit,
you know.
as long as you torch them in their name.
Right. Or you just didn't torch their temple. They didn't care. Morality was like they really did not have a they were not personally invested in the morality of their followers, really of anybody. And so that idea of your morality playing a role in this cosmic struggle between good and evil, that came from Zoroastrianism, which is also where the Jews got their whole apocalyptic ideas. The end of the world, was at hand, or coming in, some near future date, and you had to be ready for it, and all the rest. Yeah, that's Persian. Their idea of a segregated afterlife. Throughout the Old Testament, if you die, you went to Sheol. Everybody, you all go to Sheol, and it's just dark, dim city. It's like Jerusalem with the lights off, and nobody wants to go there. Good or bad, you all go to the same place. No one wants to go there, and that's it. That's just how it is.
I think
They
in
encounter the Persians, and all of a sudden they've got this idea of this pit in the desert full of fire and demons, and you throw the wicked down in there, and then the righteous go to this place called paradise. That those are all Persian ideas. Even the word paradise is a Persian loanword. That's where the Jews and Christians got it. They got it from the Zoroastrians.
yeah, I think the Greeks had like I didn't remember mythology all that well. It's like they had three different levels, like the bad, the good, and the in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you start to see this popping up in Judaism with the first book of Enoch. They have this one story where there's this big mountain, and it has these chambers, and people kind of get sorted in there, and um, in the future they're gonna like send people through, and the good people will go to paradise. The wicked people, they'll get thrown into the fiery pit with the Zazel and the other watchers, and the people in this other cavern, they're not quite wicked enough to be burned, but not good enough to go to paradise. So what's going to happen to them is they'll be given a second chance, and if they proclaim the name of their deity, then they'll they get to be rewarded and become immortal. They turn into stars and go up into the sky. Um, if not, well, then they miss their chance and they get thrown into the fiery pit in the desert.
Yeah, I
And
forget which book it was in the New Testament, the Gospels, but I think they first talked about that. When I forget a story, the rich man Lazarus story. They first mentioned that. I think two different
yeah,
sides. Death.
yeah. So Lazarus, he kind of first gets mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, though he's not a real person in there. He's a parable. Uh, and in there, he doesn't come back to life because, according to the parable that Jesus tells, if he had come back to life, it wouldn't be enough to convince people. And then John rewrites the story of Lazarus to be about an actual person who does come back to life. And because he returns from the dead, it does convince people to convert. So he takes the parable in Luke and turns it into a real story, in
Yeah,
which the opposite occurs, and it's like a reversal.
but back in the parable, they mentioned 2 seconds of death at
Yeah,
least.
yeah, and you can actually see kind of like a little bit of this popping up in like the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. They like in I can't remember the name of it. Ecclesiastes. He's kind of wondering like, what's the point of being good if everyone's just going to go to the same place when they die? You know, by the end of reading that book, you could tell people want there to be something more. They want something better to happen when they die. They want it to mean something. And you can only have that in the cultural zeitgeist for so long. You can only have that brewing in your minds before you make it a reality, before you say, okay, well, I've decided something does happen. Okay. Because if you're subject to wishful thinking for long enough, you're eventually going to pretend that it is a reality. Um, and of course, they're writing these things, in the wake of, Jerusalem and, Jerusalem and their temple being destroyed by the Babylonians. And a generation or so later, they're introduced to this idea in which exactly that happens. They do have something better to look forward to. After you're dead, you get to go and go to this magical place, and everything is way better. It's their wishes come true. Um, so yeah, it's the influence of Persia is frequently understated. But it was a profound influence on both Old and New Testaments.
Mm.
And without Zoroastrianism, you wouldn't have Christianity. Like it would not exist.
Yeah, I think from what I read about the Islam conquest of the area, I think Zoroastrian was one of the 3 or 4 religions that they said they could keep as long as they paid taxes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's because of the Muslim conquest that we don't have any any really old copies of these like Persian scriptures. Everything we have is from much, much later. And of course, anytime you have a religious text, it's going to change drastically over time. If you compare the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew Bible that the Jews, like the Jewish Publication Society, uses, it's only about 1,000 years old. But if you compare that to copies we found, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Greek Septuagint, which those date back like an additional 1,000 years, there are significant differences. And so you can see how much these texts evolved,
Yeah,
over the course of 1,000 years. I mean,
yeah.
like the height of Goliath changes. He gets like
Well,
50% taller.
Just look 400 years how we spoke in the King James version 400 years ago. It's totally different. That's like
Yeah,
less than 1,000 years ago.
yeah,
When
yeah.
we spoke, that when we talked.
Yep. Yeah,
So
and not just that, but also every time someone's making a copy of a text, they're making changes to it because they're not slapping it down on a copier and hitting the green button. They're writing the thing by hand, and when they encounter something they don't like, they think it must be an error, so they fix it. They change it. Um,
or they did it on purpose. They do it accidentally.
yeah, there are things where someone would write a note in the margins, and a later scribe would think that it was a sentence that was accidentally left out. So when they were copying it, they would try to find where that sentence belonged, and they would put it in. So then the next scribe who comes along, the sentence is in the text, and it then becomes part of the story. And like we could see, numerous examples of that in the Bible, throughout the Bible. Like the part in one of Paul's letters, I think maybe Second Timothy, where it talks about how women need to remain silent. That wasn't in there. It was a marginal notation. Some scribe who probably just got in a fight with his wife decided to jot that down in there in the margins, and then later scribes copying from his manuscripts inserted it into the text, and they didn't know where exactly to put it. And so in some of these early manuscripts, it shows up in different places. It shows up at the beginning of the page or the middle or way down at the end. It kind of bounces around because he just added it in the margins, and
Yeah,
it got slipped in later.
like the original Mark didn't have the post resurrection or something chapter.
Right. Everything after chapter 16, verse 8 came about much later. It's actually based on the Gospel of Luke. And yeah, like like for the first 400 years, every copy of Mark ends at verse 8, where the women they find this dude in the tomb. He tells them that Jesus has been raised up. They run away in fear and never tell anyone what they saw. The end. Everything after that was added centuries later. So yeah, and people they felt the need to make change, and they're still doing it. Um, Grab two Bibles that are the same version of the Bible, published by the same ministry, at least 10 years apart, and start flipping through page by page and comparing them. Like I have two Gideon King James Bibles. One is about 10 years old, the other's about 30 years old. And you can't get through page one without seeing differences. This is one ministry, one version of the Bible, one publishing company.
In modern times.
During my life, since I was born, the first one was printed when I was about 15. And already that many changes. There was one version, I'm trying to remember which one. God, I can't remember all the abbreviations, but it was a group of theologians in like Colorado Springs who came up with a version of the Bible to be like extremely like regressive, because that's what they wanted, and so they went through and like deliberately made a bunch of changes, and that's what the King James is. The King James was an effort to bring the scriptures in line with the Anglican Church. That was the purpose of the King James. Here's the things you need to change. Here's the theology the book needs to present. Make the Bible say what we want it to say.
Wow, governments controlling how the worship. Never heard that before.
Right. Like people think that theology comes from Scripture, but Scripture equally comes from theology. And if your theology evolves and your book does not, it causes conflict within the congregation because you're preaching one thing from the pulpit and your congregation is reading something else in the book. The book has more authority, so you change the book. And over
is that
time,
one of the reasons why the Bible is only written in Latin for so long?
Like a lot of that was control. You can make it say whatever you want because,
the peasants can't read it.
Yeah. So that's definitely part of it. So yeah, it's very strange and convoluted. And when like the Protestant Reformation came along, that was one of the things they really did not like the idea that everyone needed to read the Bible in Latin. And it should be opened up more. And of course, their method of doing this was to go through the Bible and change a bunch of things that they didn't like. If they saw something that supported Catholic theology, well, they changed it.
Yeah.
And say, the Catholics must have put that in there.
Yeah, funny story. I was reading a thing about there's time which side the Orthodox or the Orthodox thought they both were the Orthodox people in the East thought they both were crazy, both the Catholics and the Protestants. They thought they were both heretics. They didn't care.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the common denominator among Christianity is that every single denomination is the true one, and every other one is the heretic. And what's funny is if you go back 500 years, every modern denomination would have been burned at the stake, because they would not have tolerated any of this. And if you went back another 500 years, it'd be completely unrecognizable. Some of these earliest Christians, they had these bizarre beliefs, like they weren't going to die. They were going to go into a coma, and then they were going to come out transformed into these gleaming white figures, and they would fly up into the sky and become stars. This was early Christianity. If people today went back 2,000 years, they would not recognize what they saw. It was a doomsday cult out in the desert that thought the world was going to end within the next few years. And then the problem was it didn't. And it kept not ending.
So was each of the four Gospels a different cult of Christianity?
Basically, yeah. Mark kind of appealed more toward like Gentiles. Matthew is definitely more of a Jewish gospel. Uh, John is vehemently anti-Jewish. Like it's not just like kind of like a Pauline thing where he's like, "Oh, I'm going for the Gentiles," but Jews are cool too. John is like, "No, they're all evil. They're all cursed. They're a bunch of scumbags." And so like each one had their own different views, and each one was meant for a small group of people in one little area. They were meant for like the Christians in a city. Uh, they weren't meant for all Christians. They were meant for this group. Um,
So John is probably where the Christians got their anti-Semitism from.
uh, Not exactly. It was one of those things. It kind of became the mouthpiece of it. But that's not where it started. Because what you have to remember is that Christianity came from different theism. Like early
Yeah.
on, there was no such thing as Christianity. It wasn't Christians. They were all Jews. All of these people were Jews. And they were recruiting people who were non-Jews, but some of them were converting to Judaism. And they were becoming Jews in order to follow these teachings. But they were different sects of Judaism. And some of them had not been, active in the temple for, maybe since like the mid second century BC. So you're talking a couple hundred years, and they really didn't like the temple. Um, they thought the priests were corrupt. Even in Matthew, he talks about the corruption in the temple. And even inside the temple itself, you've got different groups vying for control. Like you've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they vehemently disagree with each other on different things. So you didn't have Judaism as this monolithic entity, and then Christianity as another one. It was all Jews. It was all these different Jews, and they all bickered about different things to different degrees. And some of them thought that the Jews in the temple were evil, and some in the temple thought the Jews outside the temple were evil. You can see this like in the first book of Enoch. They talk about all the horrible, evil things that the Jews in the temple have done, and how they've created all these false scriptures.
So how did I get from a sect of Jews to doing that to put them all in the one basket?
So basically, what happened is, so you have all these different Jews, and they're all kind of bickering, and then the Romans come along. Now, most of the Jews in the temple were playing nice with the Romans, but the Jews outside the temple were not. And so they were very antagonistic toward the Romans. And this eventually led to the first Jewish war from 66 to 70 CE. And that culminated in the second destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The Romans did the same thing that Babylon did. They went in, they destroyed the whole thing, they looted the place. A bunch of Jews got killed, a bunch more got scattered. And then you had the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Like 100 something AD.
Yeah. So second century, basically they're like, okay, look, we're finally going to kick out the Romans, and it doesn't happen. And the Romans, they really, you do not revolt if you live in the Roman Empire. You can do a lot of things. They're cool with a lot of stuff. Revolution, rebellion, no, they put you up on sticks if you do that. And so they came down really hard on them. It was, in many ways worse than the War of 70. And so then Jews got even further scattered. And basically in this sort of exile, sort of the same thing happened after Babylon.
Yeah,
Um, they
I
kind of
heard that.
came together again to form a sort of cultural identity to preserve themselves in this sort of new diaspora, and they kind of coalesced um, in many ways in Babylon, and that's where this newer Jewish identity was sort of born, was in this Roman diaspora.
Yeah, I heard that around the second revolt, that's about the time that the Romans gave that area around the Palestine name.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Philistia. Um, yeah. It's what's kind of strange is it's actually hard to find Israel as a people group in the pre-Roman times. There's very like you've got references to Judah, but when they talk about Israel, there's like some really old inscriptions about a tribe. But when you're talking about this whole big group of people, it's kind of hard to find that as a distinct sort of like people group or identity. Um,
Yeah,
and
I
it may
had
be because we
when
don't
I was
have good
talking.
records of it, but it may be because it's kind of a product of a later time.
Yeah, also when
So
I was talking with digital Habarani, talked about how the Israelites may have been an inside job from the Canaanites instead of an
yeah,
invading force.
yeah. So the the whole idea of like the Canaanites and Israelites having this conflict, um, it almost seems like basically what they're talking about isn't a different ethnic group, but it's more like a disparaging way of talking about other people of the same group who just have different practices. So if they're practicing something uh, that this group sees as an outside practice or an incorrect practice, then they call them Canaanites. And so it's basically just political propaganda. It would be like if imagine if the millennials were looking at the boomers and they're like, "Oh, like you do this thing, you still use a street map to navigate instead of the GPS on your phone?" Yeah, that's because you're a Russian. And that's what they're doing there. It's one group of people who have a certain set of religious beliefs pointing their finger at another group of people and saying, "You're not a true person in this country because you use these practices that we identify as outside practices." Like the child sacrifice is one of the things. Oh, you practice child sacrifice, you're a filthy Canaanite. Yahweh, would never do something like that. That's an evil thing of Baal. Um, but we know that that was part of Yahweh worship. Like we have like the story of Jephthah's daughter. He makes a deal with Yahweh, and this in the book of Judges. He makes a deal with Yahweh. Hey, look, you let me win this battle, and when I come home, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my tent.
Oh. Yeah,
And
hell, even before that, Isaac.
yeah. You've got the thing with Isaac. So it's like uh like human sacrifice was a thing that they
Yeah.
did to some degree,
Yeah, I
but
wonder if
some
that was
groups
really this.
didn't like it, and so they said, okay, if you sacrifice your children to Yahweh, you're actually sacrificing to this other god, and you're not a real resident of Judah. You're a filthy Canaanite.
Yeah,
They're all Canaanites. They were all Canaanites.
yeah. I wonder if that story later on they retconned it, so saying that God stopped them was only a test the whole time.
Uh, the final like lines of that thing right before it moves on to the next scene, it talks about how like after the whole thing, he gets stopped and all that. Abraham then descends the mountain to go back to his wife, Sarah, and he goes down the mountain alone. In the original story, Isaac died, and then he goes down to the mountain alone. At some point, they changed the story to have this intervention, which actually that's a scene that's borrowed from a story, a Greek story in which the guy doing the sacrifice gets interrupted by a divine messenger. They get a ram, and that the skin of that ram is what becomes the golden fleece that Jason and the Argonauts have to go and find. But so yeah, it pretty much seems like that is how the story ended. Like he got killed, and then Abraham goes down the mountain alone, and then Sarah goes and she basically dies of grief, and that's it.
And
And then they
there
added
goes
this
the ancestry
line, and if you take out the thing about how he gets interrupted, and you take out like 2 sentences, just skip them and read the thing, you'll be like, oh, I see how the story continued. Yeah, and so it's one of those things, and Jewish scholars have noticed this for a couple of centuries. Like they've been writing about this for centuries, that Isaac originally was killed in the story. But yeah, it's
It kind of makes him
all really strange and convoluted.
It kind of makes him hard to be the father of the twins later on if he's dead.
Right. Yeah. And so it's oh god, there was a book. I'm trying to remember the name of it. But there was a book, I think it's like The Death and Resurrection of the Favored Son or something like that. You can find it on Amazon. And it's about how the story of the sacrifice of Isaac was gradually changed as they eventually came to reject the practice of human sacrifice. There's also another book called Human Sacrifice in Ancient Israel by Heath Drewell. That's another good one on the topic of the ancient Israelites and Judahites like offering up their children.
Yeah, like there's also a different not origin story, but different. Like the book of Kings and Samuel is different from the book of Chronicles. Different telling.
Yeah, Chronicles was kind of like the Gospels. It was meant to replace Samuel and Kings. You weren't supposed to have Samuel and Kings and the book of Chronicles. You were supposed to have Chronicles, and that was it. You know, basically the Levites wanted to rewrite the history, and so they rewrite the stories. They use Samuel and Kings as the basis, and they're like, okay, so this thing's happening, and these people are doing this, and then a bunch of Levite priests come out of nowhere and kick everyone's ass. Okay, next story. And then they go on. Oh, and then the Levites came out and they did this. And that's what the whole thing is. It's just, they're just retelling Samuel and Kings with these weird little interjections in which these Levites just pop up out of nowhere and completely steal the scene.
Of course, I think, if I remember correctly, I haven't read, it's been a while since I've did details, but the Chronicles starts in the middle part of Samuel. Samuel's already dead Samuel's already dead by then.
Yeah,
so I think it starts with David as king.
Yeah, it kind of does like a quick little summary, and then it picks up right there. And Samuel and Kings looks to have actually been a similar thing, where it was a rewrite of a book of the somethings of the kings of Judah or something. Basically, it was the same thing. They had these books, they had these stories about their kings, and the books of Samuel and Kings were basically rewriting that material to take its place, and it succeeded. The old things eventually were gone, and Samuel and Kings is what was copied. And then when Chronicles came along, it tried to do it again, but there were too many copies of Samuel and Kings floating around, so they both got preserved. So we have both versions, the same way we have, Matthew and the older Gospel of Mark. We weren't supposed to have both. We're only supposed to have the one.
Yeah, plus I also heard that there used to be there used to be two books. I mean, there used to be Samuel, one book of Samuel, one book of Kings, one book of Chronicles. They weren't two different parts to it. I heard.
Yeah, so in some of the things, it looks like Samuel was probably like its own story, and then Kings was its own story. But then they wrote them as like one big thing, and it kind of became like one big, text. Even though it looks like Samuel and Kings each had their own authors. Um, and then, of course, we further subdivided it and made First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, though some Bibles label it as First, Second, Third, and Fourth Kings, just to confuse people.
Yeah.
And then, Chronicles was one text, but yeah, it kind of got separated into two.
It's funny. Even the first book of Samuel, Samuel's only in it for like not even maybe like half or a little bit more than half of the book. Samuel's the main character. The rest of the Samuel's not even in it.
Yeah, he's there to like he kind of pops up. He does a few things, and then he kind of recruits Saul to be king, and then he kind of goes and he nominates David to also be a king. Dies, and then Second Samuel, he's not even present at all. He's already dead. So
yeah, I think First Samuel ends with Saul trying to resurrect his ghost or something.
Yeah, he visits the witch of Endor, and he needs some advice before a battle, and he brings up the ghost of Samuel and talks to him. And then after that, he goes and like he gets killed. And what's weird is like in the stories about David, we've gotten multiple stories about how David just got introduced, into the story, how he came to be, introduced to Saul and how he became king. Like in one story, Samuel goes and tracks him down and anoints him to be the king. In another story, he just happens to be walking by and they're having this big battle, and he's like, "Oh, hang on, I can go kill that giant." And he goes over there and he kills him. He kind of just accidentally wanders into the battle and kind of gets stuck in it,
I think it was, I don't know if it was the third one or other ones. I don't know if it was the third one or is part of the other two where he becomes like a harp player for the king.
Yeah, Saul is suffering from like migraines, and he gets, he has this harp player play this soothing music to him. And during that, that he gradually kind of works his way up through the thing, in a sort of a story similar to Joseph at the end of Genesis, where he's like this nobody who kind of ends up in the court, and his value becomes known, and eventually he, is elevated in position. And the story of Goliath wasn't even originally about David. It was about Elhanan, one of his like captains who killed Goliath. And then they took that story and made it about David and placed it earlier in the book. So yeah, it's all convoluted. I think when I was doing covering Samuel, I think I found like maybe 4 or 5 different stories of how David gets introduced to the audience, because there were just all these different stories about who the guy was, and so they're all just getting kind of collected. So
Joseph's another one. The two different routes of how he got to Egypt, the Midianites or the Ishmaelites.
Yeah. He gets sold to one group, or then maybe he's sold to another group. Though later in the story, there's actually a reference to a third version that isn't included. So there were actually 3 different versions of how he ended up getting to Egypt, like who took him down there. two of them are preserved in the story, and a third one gets referenced later on in the closing chapters of Genesis. I think I covered that in like episode 14.
Mm.
It's really interesting stuff to see that. Or the same thing, like there's this one little spot in Canaan that Abraham buys, and like he digs a well, and the place gets a name and all that. And then later you find out that Isaac comes in and he buys the exact same plot of land and digs a well and changes its name and everything else. And it's like, wait,
Yeah.
didn't your dad do this like 30 years ago?
Well, Isaac played the same trick his dad did, telling him his wife's his sister. For the king of the area.
You know,
like father, like son.
Yeah. So it's just, they have all these different legends about how this stuff happened, and all these variant tales.
And the funny thing is that Abraham did it twice. He did first time he did it with Egypt, and he did again with the
first time in Egypt, the second time in Gerar with King Abimelech, and then Isaac goes down to the same King Abimelech in Gerar with his, not his sister wife like Abe, but with his cousin wife. Was it Rebecca?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Back when incest was still allowed.
Yeah. So it's this huge mess of stories that are so convoluted because you were never supposed to read this as one book. You were supposed to read a story. You were supposed to hear the time that Abraham went to Egypt with Sarai and sold her into the Pharaoh's harem, or you were supposed to hear about Isaac going down to Gerar and tricking King Abimelech. You weren't supposed to have all the versions of the story. These were, kind of independent stories. They were variant tales. So
do we know what the origin of Joseph was? Like where that came from? Its history?
The exact thing is, it's still one of those things where people have put forth different ideas as to where it came from. But there are parts in there where it does seem to show a knowledge of the book of Exodus. So it looks like it may have been a thing meant to bridge the gap between Genesis and Exodus. So
why they were in Egypt to begin with?
Right. And even that's kind of a bit misleading, because you weren't supposed to read Genesis and then read Exodus. Genesis was one story about where they came from. Exodus was another story about where they came from. These were two competing ideas that were meant to explain the origin of the people living in the land. And these are very much products of a post-exilic period. And while certain parts of the stories may have been older than that, they were using them in the post-exilic period to explain where they came from and why they had a right to be in the land and why they had the right to rule the place and the locals didn't. And so what they're doing is they're compiling different stories, and so you have the patriarchal stories, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and where they came from. And then you have you look at how it closes out. They basically give birth to all these different sons who were going to become the different tribes of Israel, so they can then spread out across Canaan and rule the place, right? And then you have the story of Moses, where it's these people who live in Egypt, and then they're going to leave Egypt and they're going to go to this promised land. And he's going to bring with them these chiefs who he divides up in the deserts when he gives them the law. He's going to divide them up into groups. They're going to kind of govern their own little groups of people. And the land is going to be divvied up when they get there. And that's a second ideological tale for where the people came from. You weren't supposed to read Genesis and Exodus, but then they're putting these things together. And suddenly you've got two stories about, these groups of people who one came from Ur of the Chaldees, from Babylon, and traveled west into Judah, and another came from Egypt and traveled northeast. And they're both doing the same thing, introducing 12 tribes and a bunch of laws to rule the land. Okay, we need to fix this. Let's put a thing where a guy takes them from one place and brings them to the other, and then they can come back. So basically, they come from Babylon and they go to Judah, and then they have to detour and come right back to Judah. And it's kind of like how later Christians would sort of try to harmonize the Gospels of Matthew and Luke by having them start off in Bethlehem and go over to, or start off in Nazareth and go to Bethlehem and then go to Egypt and go back up to Nazareth, and basically come up with a third nativity story that doesn't exist in either gospel. That's what Joseph does. He makes it so that Genesis and Exodus are not parallel stories to explain where they came from, but now puts them in a chronological order, and now they're not contemporaries. It's one and then another. And
like
so that's
like
what
the
it is.
same with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2.
Sort of, yeah. And how people would later say that, okay, well, the first chapter of Genesis is all the big stuff. It's where the universe came from. And then the second chapter, that's like a little microcosm. He gets down and he's fine-tuning everything. Well, that's not what the story is. It's two different creation stories. But they're trying to say, okay, he does all the big stuff, then he does the little stuff. And it's just a way of trying to harmonize it.
Like the two different versions of the flood.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, because you couldn't have... Yeah, so that they kind of went in the opposite direction, because in those, they both end with the God making a promise to never do it again. Well, you can't do that, and then he turns right around and does it again in the next chapter. So what they did there was kind of put them both together, happening at the same time. And then for the Genesis Exodus thing, instead of them both happening at the same time, they separated them so that one happens and then another happens. Yeah, so that's why attempts to come up with a like a chronology of the Bible.
Yeah,
you can't do that. These things, they were not written to be a linear history where Genesis leads to Exodus. Genesis and Exodus were two different stories, both attempting to do a very similar thing. So yeah, it's a huge, convoluted, and confusing mess.
Yeah, like one flood story says only two people, or not two at a time. The other one is some 2 and some 7.
Yeah, two of, like, a pair of some animals and 7 pairs. So it's 2 and 14. All the kosher animals got 14, and the non-kosher animals, it was just pairs of them. Which is weird because they don't even have kosher laws yet.
I wonder if Answers in Genesis make that count and their arc numbers, the 7.
Right. Yeah, show me where you stored the 14 African elephants, and then show me where you stored the 14 Indian elephants.
I wonder if dinosaurs were considered clean animals or unclean animals.
Oh, I don't know, man. That I'm sorry, giant lizards can't be kosher.
But they're birds.
That actually makes it worse, because they really like things to fit into neat little categories, and they're covered in feathers, but they don't fly. That's definitely an abomination bird. That's worse than shrimp. It's worse than having cloven hooves and not chewing cud, being a bird that can't fly. Ostriches aren't kosher, so a velociraptor, definitely not. Yeah. There was only 2 T-Rexes on the ark, for sure.
Doesn't matter. They all get killed off right afterwards, anyways.
Yeah. Although I have heard that there was that they were so corrupt that they weren't allowed on the ark, and that's why they all died. Or they couldn't survive in the post-flood world, and that's why they went extinct. Which I mean, like, wouldn't God have seen that and be like, "Oh, you know what? I'm going to kill these off later," and just be like, "Hey, Noah, don't the big scary birds, just leave them off," you know. Um,
Only the
know,
bite-sized birds that you.
yeah. But then again, if he said no scary birds, then the cassowary definitely wouldn't have made it, you know. So I don't know. I'm yet
Or
I've
the
yet
or
to
the
find
ki
him.
or the kiwis.
Yeah. I mean, come on, that's not kosher, you know. And I don't know. But I gave up trying to make sense of, you know, anything from Answers in Genesis. Um, Ken Ham used to believe the earth was flat and that the flood caused it to change shape and become round. And the jets of water that came up from the ground in like Genesis 7 or 8 shattered the firmament, and that's where comets came from.
Yeah,
Like,
I
I'm
actually.
not joking. He used to believe that. There's some old, like, you can still find it. There's some old, like, writings of his floating around on the internet from like back in the 80s, that kind of got recycled, and are floating around on like some old message boards and stuff. That popped up like in the late 90s and early 2000s about his bizarre beliefs about the firmament being shattered by the uh the fountains. And yeah,
So the flood made the Earth a globe.
yeah, it shattered because like basically it was all flat and it became flooded, and then after it all got done there was nowhere for the water to go, so the whole earth transformed into a ball and the continents pushed up out of the water, and that allowed the water to drain.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
like
know
that's what the guy used to preach.
he
uh
still thinks, or some people think that the flood made the ice age happen.
yeah. Yeah, it's a really bizarre stuff. I mean, like there are also people who keep trying to link the flood, you know, with some sort of actual like massive catastrophes, like when the Mediterranean filled up, you know, because like the Strait of Gibraltar used to actually be all land, and at some point it broke, like I don't know, 20,000 years ago or something, and the water from the Atlantic rushed in and filled up that whole big area.
Yeah, I heard
Something
one
similar
where.
happened around the Black Sea and stuff.
Yeah, I heard that
Uh,
one too. Like that's what the origin of the flood was, for like the Black Sea flooded or something, and
yeah, and
they
the
what's
problem with that, I mean, there's multiple problems. I mean, one, um, we've got like we have geological, evidence to show that, but we have no stories from anyone in that area of a tale that remotely resembles that. Um, so these people, they all died out and eventually forgot about it over the course of 10,000 plus years. But the other thing is that the story of Noah's flood, like we know where it came from. It came from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which they were reading in Judah in its original language. Like we've got fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay, and the details in the flood story in Genesis like 7 through 9 match so closely that we can actually tell which version of the story of Utnapishtim it came from. It came from the version that's in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it was like 24, 25 separate parallels that come directly from that section of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It didn't. The Genesis story did not come from the story that inspired the story of Utnapishtim. Like it didn't come from the story of Ziasudra or Atrahasis. Those are the stories that inspired the tale of Utnapishtim. the Genesis authors copied it from Gilgamesh because there are details added to Gilgamesh, to the story of Utnapishtim, that are not present in the older stories of Atrahasis or Ziusudra, that
So
are
was
only found in Utnapishtim's story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that are then found in Genesis. So we know where it came from. And those stories of Ziusudra and Utnapishtim and Atrahasis come from one place, and that's the Euphrates River, where about 4,000 years ago it was flooded, actually several times over the course of about a century. It had several catastrophic floods, and it inspired this story about a very small group of people who survived by building a massive boat, and they took some animals in it. So we know where it came from. It came from the city of Shurapak, this one set of floods and on the Euphrates River. And so trying to link it to something that happened, an asteroid in the Indian Ocean or the Black Sea, or something else, it doesn't match what we have. What we have is the details that came from a specific tale, and that tale came from another tale, which came from another tale, which came from the city of Shurapak, which came from the flooding of the Euphrates about 4,500 years ago. And so, yeah, we know the story of Noah. It's sort of historical, but it doesn't resemble what's in the Bible.
Yeah. So the Book of Gilgamesh and earlier ones, were they still using the clay tablets by then, or the clay tablets been made into the paper pipe, whatever they call it?
There's actually I think if you Google Gilgamesh Megiddo fragment, it's actually a clay tablet in cuneiform. So Gilgamesh, it was widely distributed. It was translated into like a dozen languages. It was like the Stephen King novel of its day. Everyone all over from like Mesopotamia to like half the Mediterranean was reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was being translated. And yeah, people near Jerusalem were reading it centuries before the book of Genesis was being compiled.
Yeah, I forget when they stopped using the clay tablets and stone and started transferring to the more breakable, rippable paper product stuff, like papyrus and stuff.
That would be a question for someone who knows more about this than me.
Okay.
Because
after that,
I tend to learn about this thing. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Because after that, they had the copy stuff because the stuff would break down, would wear out eventually. They had the
right. Yeah, it was a lot easier to make and to distribute, because I mean, like a scroll, you can have a lot of information on it, and you can roll it up and just carry it. But clay tablets, man, those things were heavy. And if you touched them too much, then it would smudge. The only way to make it permanent was to bake it. And now you've got like this big brittle, piece of basically like pottery that you're lugging around, which would not really work for longer bits of text. So you didn't really want to have, longer stories like that. It definitely, made sense to have those on something, like sheepskin or something. In Egypt, they had papyrus. It was just these reeds that got kind of hammered together, and so that made things a lot easier. But it didn't last long. I mean, we've got clay tablets from 4,000, 5,000 years ago, but bits of the Bible, ooh, that stuff does not last in the best conditions. If it's being preserved and no one is touching it and it's sealed away in a cave, you may be able to get it to last 2,000 years. But when you take it out, it's going to be in, pieces the size of a thumbnail, and you're going to have to assemble it like a jigsaw puzzle. One scroll may be in 1,000 pieces, and it'll take a bunch of grad students years to put it together. Um, so yeah, it's uh, not a very good medium for archival purposes. Um, Though
And
our
again,
stuff
that's
today is even worse. I mean, now we use like digital media that's, often stored magnetically and can sometimes break down over the course of just a couple of years. So, in a 50 years, most of our stuff is going to be gone.
yeah. I wonder if they had kept the clay tablets. There still have been translation errors since you had to copy the clay tablets off.
Yeah, that is one good thing about the clay tablets is that because you don't have to make copies as often, um, you don't have as many generations between where you are and the original. Um, but at the same time, you are looking at some really ancient languages that you're working with, and
Plus, it'd been hard to
you're
transport them to. They're at that one position.
yeah,
You might carrying them might accidentally trip and break.
right. So yeah, it is, while it is longer lasting, it's also more prone to certain types of damage. So
Like the what was the head of Barbera laws.
yeah.
That big. I don't know how big it was.
Yeah, it's like I don't know, like a 6-7 foot tall sort of like obelisk, with the like the coat of Hammurabi on it. Um, that like the Babylonians, they basically erected these things in like every major city. So if you want to know what the laws were, you just went to the town square and read them. They were right there in front of you. That's kind of like the idea of the the stone tablets from Moses. It's their version of, okay, yeah, we're going to get the law and it's going to be on display for everyone to see. And so once a year he comes out and he reads them to everyone. It's basically their version of something like that.
Yeah, that's where they got that thing from the tablets from Moses did from that thing in Babylon.
It seems so. Like it was like let's have our own version of like the Code of Hammurabi. Um, though the idea of a divinely appointed lawgiver, um, that's it was an old trope. And there were even stories like from Egypt where like because the Egyptians had like these ideological tales to explain where all the different cities and nations along the Mediterranean came from, and in their version of the story there were all these Egyptian princes who got on boats and they sailed out from Egypt, and they founded all the cities in the area. Like one of them went and founded the city of Athens, and he brought all these Egyptian laws to the Greeks, and that's where the Athenians got their law and their language and everything else. And another one went here, and another one went there, and one of them he went over to Jerusalem, which his name, by the way, was Moses. And he goes to Jerusalem and he builds a city called Jerusalem, and he gives these people these laws, and he establishes a ruling class of 12 representatives who each govern different tribes, and they come up with all the laws and rulings for the whole world, or for the whole nation of Judah. And so you got this sort of like divinely appointed lawgiver showing up to give these things to Jerusalem. Hammurabi had his own story like that, where he went up on a mountain, and his god gave him the law, and he carved it on this big obelisk, and this thing that probably weighed like 4,000 pounds. He just, I guess, carried it on his shoulder. Hammurabi must have been a big dude. And he brings it down, he puts it up in the city. Hey, here's our laws. God gave them to me. Um, the divine lawgiver, it was an ancient trope, and the story of Moses was just another story in which it happened. uh, there's a story in which Joshua does it. God kind of gives him the covenant, and he brings it and shares it with the people. because you weren't supposed to read the story of Joshua and the story of Moses back to back. You're supposed to know the story of Moses or the story of Joshua, not both. They're almost identical characters when you start
They
kind of
both
looking
cross
at them.
bodies of water at the beginning of their thing.
Yeah, they're like, okay, let's do a Passover and a magical water crossing in which we like wave our arms and the water stops and we march an army across. Um, you know, oh God, what was it? They both had a follower with a specific name. I'm trying to remember what it was. But there was this in one of my the episodes for the book of Joshua. I think I found like 60 something parallels between Moses and Joshua. I don't remember the exact number. It was a lot.
So
there were a lot of.
So they had to retcon the book of Moses later on to put Joshua back in there since he was his successor. They had the retcon in there.
Sort of. So like the book of Exodus went through like multiple revisions. That's why you have so many plagues. Originally there were only a few, but they kept having different versions with different plagues, and so that's why all the livestock died like 3 or 4 times. Oh, this plague happened and the hail killed all the livestock, and then the boils happened and that killed all the and then all the bugs came and they killed the livestock, and then the angel of death, and the dead livestock kept getting killed. But yeah, they like Joshua was his own person. He was a founder of Judah. Not and he was meant to be the founder of Judah, not Abraham, not Moses, but Joshua. And they just put his story right after Moses, and then they added like a couple mentions of Joshua in I think maybe there was one in the book of Numbers and a couple in Deuteronomy, and they're like, okay, cool, that's enough mentioning of Joshua, and now it's all one big story, moving on. And then Joshua just pops up and does all the same stuff that Moses did, including the miracle where he like pauses the sun in the sky and stuff like that. Yeah, it's the solar miracles and all that. Yeah, it's very much the same story. It's just a different name. So
are mainly most of these stories come from the Assyrians and Babylonians, Persian areas?
Kind of all over. So you've got some Babylonian stuff. You've got some Assyrian stuff. Like some of the stories of Solomon may have been about Shalmaneser the third or Shalmaneser the fourth. There's some evidence that. So in some of the stuff where they're recounting all the treasures that Solomon has, it looks sort of like one of these texts about one of the Shalmanezers of Assyria and all the stuff he has, and like some of the treasures are very similar. And so everything kind of contributed, really.
Yeah, plus you got talking about, is it the old Assyrians, old Babylonians, the middle Babylonians, the new Assyrians,
right.
They're different.
And now, one thing to remember is like one thing a lot of people don't understand, and this is something that scholars started to realize about 100 years ago, is that the Old Testament is not as old as it kind of pretends to be. Like the book of Genesis is talking about events that, according to the chronology that we now have, is from like 1800 BCE. Like Abraham is running around like near 1800 or thereabouts. The problem is it says that he comes from the city of Ur of the Chaldeans. And we know when the Chaldeans were in the city of Ur, it would be like saying that someone was born in Washington, D.C. under Barack Obama. It doesn't just give you a place, it gives you a time frame. And the Chaldeans occupying the city of Ur is late 7th century BCE and on. So about the time that the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem, which was
Plus,
in
the whole
the
thing is
6th
supposed to be
century.
written by one guy in the middle 1500s anyway.
Yeah. The idea, it's ridiculous.
The books of Moses, or the book of Moses.
Yeah. And then you have things like, they're over there like hanging around, and they've got like domesticated camels, which they didn't have in that region in 1800 BCE. There are problems here. There are staggering anachronisms. They're having run-ins with like the Philistines, and like we know when the Philistines came on the scene, and it wasn't then. So there's all, and also it's like the dialect that it's written in is not that old. It is not, a 4,000-year-old text. Now, there are some sections like Exodus 15 is extremely old, but that's an exception. That's a poem. It's a song about Yahweh fighting a sea monster. You got the Song of Deborah in the book of Judges. That's incredibly old, but the surrounding material is from like centuries and centuries later. It's many centuries later. It'd be like having a story, written in modern English, and then it has a poem from Shakespeare in it. You wouldn't look at that and say, oh man, this is centuries old. No, you would say, oh, look, this dude, he wrote this recently, and he inserted a poem from centuries earlier. That's the logical conclusion you would make. And so, you have stuff like that just in the text itself that shows this is not very old. But then you have stuff from outside of this. Like supposedly they basically set up like this one temple, okay, in Jerusalem, and it's the only temple. And you're never supposed to have any outside temples ever. But we've got all the way up to like the late 5th century or even early 4th century BC with other temples that are not only being operated openly, but are in frequent communication, in good standing with the priests in Jerusalem. Like in southern Egypt, in Elephantine, these are Jews, and they're communicating with the Jerusalem temple. And the ones in Jerusalem have no problem with this. They don't have any problem with these people worshiping the goddess Anat, naming their children after Egyptian gods, having this other temple to Yahweh. They don't have problems with any of this. It's all fine. More tellingly, though, when they talk about this festival in which you have this unleavened bread and stuff like that, neither them nor the Jerusalem temple know anything about the name Passover. They don't know the origin story or any of it. They know how you practice it, and it's similar to what we find in Exodus on what you're supposed to do. But they don't know the significance of it. It's just this festival. It's this little sacrifice that you make. And there's another thing. When there's a character in literature, whether they're real or fictional, and they're a popular character, then their name becomes popular with the people in the culture. Like look how many black kids were named Barack after 2008. Look how many girls, little white girls, were named Khaleesi after Game of Thrones launched on HBO. I think it was a lot. Guess how many times names like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob show up in records prior to the Babylonian exile? They don't exist. You can't find them. That we've got a plethora of records, thousands of names written down, hundreds of different names, cannot find names of any of the patriarchs. They don't seem to know about them. And then some of these practices, like there's this strange little thing that so if you have a clay vessel and you have a liquid stored in it, like olive oil, and you go to serve some out, if you pour it into another vessel, the vessel you had it in is now considered contaminated because pouring it, the impurity can, I guess, travel upstream from the non-purified vessel into the original vessel. So you would have to use like a ladle to take some out and dump it. And it says that you can't pour this because it becomes impure for clay vessels. It doesn't say anything about stone. So kosher laws, they're very meticulous about them. Stone is okay. So what do the Jews do? They start making stone vessels to store things like olive oil in. So if you want to pour out some olive oil, you could just take your stone vessel and just pour it. And it circumvents, God's wrath. Stone vessels don't start appearing in like Judah to be used for olive oil until about 150 BC. And they start appearing everywhere. Prior to that, everything's clay. And if you actually go through and you look at a bunch of these different things, like basically look for archaeological evidence that people are Torah observant, like the way communities were set up, where your latrines were in a certain place, outside the camp, but within a certain distance that you didn't have to walk too far to get there on the Sabbath, things like that, ritual bathing pools and things like that. All these things that evidence of all these types of Torah observance that would leave behind archaeological evidence. Prior to 150, they don't seem to exist. And so while some of these stories may have been older and certainly seem to be older, the widespread adoption of these laws does not seem to have happened until the mid 2nd century BC. If they did occur, it was with very small groups of people, maybe like a priestly class that was observing them, but not the general public. And if there was some kind of thing like this, it didn't really leave behind any evidence. And so these stories may be older, but widespread adoption of Torah observance is a couple 100 years older than Christianity. And so when we talk about like some of these old stories, we have to remember that they may not be as old as we think. The evidence certainly seems to point to a lot of these things being much, much younger. Unfortunately, because the Bible came together in bits and pieces, and these people rewrote their own history multiple times, we don't know exactly when this happened, just that it did, and we don't know how widespread it was when it happened.
Yeah,
It's real convoluted.
Plus the stuff that we kept out or add on later on tells quite a different story. Well, I hate to cut this short, but you said you had stuff to do. It's been 2 hours now.
Oh, wow.
like I said, sometimes we just go on for...
Yep.
So I'd love to continue this at a future time. We can find a new thing to continue on this about. But is there anything you want to advertise for something coming up on your channel?
So like I said, I do a monthly secular Bible study. If you want, whether you're atheist, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, if you want to learn what the Bible says without being preached at, without someone interjecting their personal beliefs, their sectarian theology, just an honest approach as to what the book says, where the stories came from, based on the latest scholarship, then basically a starting point for understanding the Bible. then just head over to dragonsandgenesis.com or pick up any podcast app, Apple Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, Spreaker, whatever, and just search Dragons in Genesis and look for the big orange logo with a silhouette of Godzilla attacking Jerusalem. It's easy to find me. I'm everywhere. After I publish the episodes, I tend to port them over to YouTube. I try to get them done as quick as possible, but sometimes it takes a little bit. But they all get ported over to YouTube, so you can listen to them on there. And
is it just audio or is it any visual?
It's just audio. Basically, I throw up like some nifty little graphic for like almost like a title screen, and then I just input the audio from the audio format podcast. The only exception to that is going to be episode 69, which was my 69. Valentine's episode, in which I, in a really deep voice, set to some really suggestive music, read the entirety of the Song of Solomon. And it's filled with all sorts of ridiculous imagery. Check that one out. That was a full production. But yeah, otherwise it's all just the audio format stuff.
Let's see, for me, I only have anything coming up this rest of the month. March is going to be a dead month. I'll probably be working on hopefully I work on my novel. Knock on wood, get this stuff done. But at the end of the month, me and Snick and Julian will be doing the finale of our MCU review with Phase 5, the last of the current MCU project. Until Phase 6 hasn't come out yet, and then beginning of April, I'm going to have Detroit Atheist Queen on. We're talking about. I don't know yet, but we haven't really got the details of the day and the time of that wrapped out. So there, and hopefully me and Bree can finally get together and do our cephalopod episode that she wanted to do from like 5 years ago at this point, or 3 years ago. It's been a long planning stage, and then hopefully I can have you back on in the future, and we can continue that where we left off.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so do you have a catchphrase you say in your podcast?
Not really. Just keep reading your Bibles. We need more atheists.
As I always say, never stop learning and enjoy the randomness. We'll see you next time. Bye. Hey, thanks for watching my podcast or Let's Play. If you want to help support my channel, you can make a monthly or yearly pledge on Patreon, or just a one-time donation on Vimeo, PayPal, or Cash App. For those looking for something to wear, we have some shirts, hats, and other stylish things in our merch store. If you enjoy gaming, you can always follow and sub to me on Twitch. For those who don't want to give money, I have an Amazon and Steam wish list who can help the channel out. And of course, just liking, leaving a comment, and sharing this video helps more than you can imagine. And always remember to never stop learning and enjoy the randomness.